Dr. Jeffrey Nall has very kindly returned to stimulate our minds with another inspiring presentation. The topic is a most pertinent one today, getting our priorities straight, humanities and the art of living. Dr. Nall teaches philosophy and humanities courses for Indian River State College and the University of Central Florida. Dr. Nall also teaches courses in Florida Atlantic University's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department. He also hosts an online Substack newsletter, Humanities in Revolt. Thank you, Dr. Nall.
Since June 2010, I've been teaching college courses in the humanities. Over the years, I've learned that most people don't really know what the humanities are before entering a humanities college classroom. I've also learned that this lack of knowledge doesn't stop most people from concluding that the humanities are a complete waste of time. And to be honest with you, this is something that I can relate to, as I recall being a community college student, begrudgingly forced to take a humanities survey course and then also an ethics course. Frustrated that I was being sidetracked from my preferred course of study, which at the time was film. So yes, you got that right. I did not know that film was part of the humanities. One of the chief lessons of the humanities is that those students who stick it out for the semester is the folly of judging something before you understand it. And the humanities is a field of study that, in a very Jesus-like fashion, loves everyone, including those who are, at least at the onset, its enemies, or at least rather hostile, to the field of study. And the wisdom of loving our enemies is revealed when we discover that much of what our enemies hate about us is based on prejudice and ignorance. My experience shows again and again that those who learn what the humanities are and what they enable us to understand are quickly converted from passive enemies to vocal supporters. This includes many majoring in fields like health science, biological science, technology, mathematics. I've had more than a few engineering students at the University of Central Florida, for example, remarked that their experience with humanities was humanizing, that it allowed them to think in a more reflective manner, and that it facilitated contemplation of direct and fundamental matters of concern to them in their lives, their personal development, their relationships with other people, their values, their purpose. Just last semester, a student graduating from Indian River State College, where I also teach, sent me a note about her experience, and she gave me permission to share part of it, and it read this way. She said, "I was in one of your evening virtual humanities classes last spring, and I always looked forward to class every week. The lectures and discussions we had in class often became dinner topics. It expanded my views and helped me to consider all angles of a subject and to question things. I think the world would be a better place if everyone were to take a class like this. Then maybe we would all understand each other a little better. The thought of a world where people can disagree and have spirited debate without having to win or resort to pettiness is the world I wish for future generations. That is why," she wrote, "humanities are so important, and you made it interesting and enjoyable to learn. You created a safe space for everyone to speak their mind, even if many in my class chose not to speak at all," end quote. So you can see why that was such a powerful message to receive from someone who, again, was taking it because it was a requirement. It was an obligation. It wasn't something they set out to find. And so it's my view that the humanities are at their best, something that invites us to contemplate the human condition from an array of perspectives, including those that we don't identify with, those that challenge us, and some that also, very importantly, even may repulse us. The humanities remind us again and again that being discomforted or unfamiliar with an idea, belief, or expression is not evidence that it is wrong. Neither is it evidence that it is right. The humanities give us a seat at the table of cultural creation. We learn to critically examine beliefs and institutions, cultural practices, traditions, things that are very familiar and perhaps also dear to us. Where did they come from? How were they formed? What do they teach us about ourselves? Do they enable us to flourish, or do they actually hold us back from developing our fullest humanity? And so it's in this sense that I think that the humanities force us into what is often a blinding light of cultural difference, like the captives in Plato's allegory of the cave, to lay claim to our intellectual autonomy and our creative responsibility as cultural creators as well as cultural consumers. The path to my teaching vocation, as I currently experience it, is pretty different from the way a lot of my colleagues in academia found theirs. I was absolutely nothing better than a very mediocre student at best throughout my entire primary school education. And I dropped out of high school in my senior year. It's kind of, if you're going to do it, you figure you might as well do it sooner. But anyway, it wasn't just my senior year, it was the last quarter. But anyway, 13 years later, I earned a doctorate in comparative studies from Florida Atlantic University. And if I'm being very honest with you, I regret absolutely nothing. Actually, dropping out of high school was probably one of my first experiences of autonomy. This definitively agentic decision began a shift in my consciousness about my thinking about what was possible and permissible. Because up to that point, I experienced schooling as, tedious, it was lifeless, it was automated, it was really narrowly conceived. It was something that other people did to me and without my consultation. It's something that I endured with the goal of a kind of perfunctory completion, rather than viewing it as something that's intrinsically valuable to me, something that I was motivated to do for myself. And what was very affirming, I suppose you could say, is that I would go on to learn there's a whole long list of great thinkers, from Emerson, Thoreau, to Emma Goldman, and Jack London, and Albert Einstein, Maria Montessori, Erich Fromm. The list goes on. Paul Goodman, Maslow, Ivan Illich, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Bell Hooks, that these figures believed that the dominant system of schooling failed in so many ways. It failed to cultivate and even undermine critical thinking and creativity and anti-authoritarian democratic values, that it often alienated kids from their natural intellectual abilities, from their natural love and joy of learning. And so I was surprised to learn just how many great thinkers vehemently objected to schooling's emphasis on that purely didactic, one-sided model of learning, this emphasis on competition among students. What's your GPA? What's your score? How do you compare to this one and that one? And that emphasis on accumulating information, knowing lots of data, like we're just databases. Memorizing information to what? To score well on a test. And by the way, these were criticisms of schooling before we had the standard of teaching to the test that is so familiar to us. As an aspiring writer, I also found it very intriguing to learn that creative figures like Mark Twain had very little formal schooling. Twain and Jack London, actually, were both school dropouts, making it, I think, deliciously ironic that each man has a school named after them. Twain left school after 5th grade and never returned, and Jack London left school at the age of 14. And then he returned a few years later. He did his 4 years of high school in 1 year, went to Berkeley out in California, and then abandoned that ship and just decided to be a writer all by himself. These two great American writers and thinkers, I think, at least for me, teach that the ideas of schooling and education are not identical. Schools are not the only means to education. Twain and London were steeped in works and ideas of great thinkers and works of the humanities. They procured this education through life experience, through experimentation, through concentrated, serious study, much of which, by the way, was made possible by public libraries, which they relied upon a great deal. Formal schooling, however, was a minor factor in their education, something I think we would all do well to keep in mind. Disentangling learning from schooling for me was important because I wanted nothing to do with school, as I mentioned. As someone who probably had and still has undiagnosed dyslexia, I particularly disliked reading. I recall being admitted to an honors English class at one point in my high school career only to very obstinately refuse to do the assigned readings and assignments. And I literally failed that class miserably, and I'm sure that I was a complete nuisance to the teacher, so I'm sorry about that. My children, it's interesting, my children find this to be a very strange portrait of their father. It does not really comport with the reality of living in what's a pretty small house, about 1,000 square feet, that's made all the much smaller by their father's myriad, books squeezed onto buckling bookshelves, and the fact that there's hardly a flat surface that's unadorned by some dog-eared and scribbled-in book. My love of reading actually began when I left school, though, and when I took a 72-hour bus ride from Homestead, Florida, where I grew up, to Los Angeles, California, to work a minimum wage job as a production assistant on a movie nobody's ever watched called Cement. And at the time I was 18, had this abysmal GPA, which partially was a contributing factor to me dropping out. I think it was about 1.7 out of 4. All right, it's pretty bad. And before I left, what I did is I had the good sense to go meet with my journalism teacher at the time, Mr. Valanci. And he knew that I wanted to be a writer. And so what he did is he didn't really browbeat me about the dropping out. I mean, he was a little surprised. He was disapproving. But he said, okay, you know what? You're going to leave. You need some things to take with you. And so he gives me this bundle of books. He gives me Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. He gives me Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. And I take them with me. And I was at the time, and I still am actually, a pretty slow reader, if I'm being honest. And when I wasn't out there in LA, when I wasn't running errands for movie makers, when I wasn't doing things like dropping off scripts at the house to the actress Sherilyn Fenn, who was in Twin Peaks, when I wasn't running canisters of the day's film to be processed, or when I wasn't bringing that processed film to a director's home in Hollywood Hills, all of which was much more fun than being in high school, by the way, when I wasn't calling companies to get freebies for the movie, like free soda, some beer, even managed to help get the cement mixer because the movie was called Cement. It's a mafia film. You can fill in the rest. When I wasn't doing those things, I would read. I spent half the time, of course, looking up words, though, without the advantage of a smartphone, Google, and all that good stuff. And 25 years later, actually, I still have that copy of The Jungle that my teacher gave to me. It's this 1960s Signet classic, and I was looking at it the other day before I gave this presentation, and the back of the cover is crisscrossed with this cacophony of diagonally written words like incredulous, indubious, and obdurate. Vocabulary words. I mean, it took a long time to read this book, But that relationship with education, my relationship with formal education, changed when I came home and my mom said, all right, you at least got to get this GED thing out of the way, all right? You at least got to do that, which I did. And I enrolled in Miami-Dade Community College with the intent of getting this 2-year film degree. And then I was forced to take one of these damn humanities classes, not the film class, because, of course, that to me didn't register as a humanities class. I had to take an ethics class, an intro to ethics class. The radically open and imaginative yet temperate exchange of ideas in that classroom was, to me, electric. The environment exuded this idea of the love of wisdom. I had rarely encountered in a formal education setting. Certainly never experienced that prior to college. And while I was very lucky, I grew up in a family where questioning and debate, usually in very loud volumes, was very normal. But the philosophy classroom, it was different. It was like nothing I had experienced before. There were unasked questions that were articulated, questions that people didn't necessarily have an answer for, but they were okay with asking. Discouraged opinions were actually brought out. They were teased out by the professor into open dialogue. Uncomfortable contradictions were highlighted instead of avoided. And the beauty of creative, critical introspection was unshackled from conventional, commonsensical expectations. Virtually nothing in this academic space was taken for granted as self-evident. All political moral beliefs were equally scrutinized. All methods of knowing were scrutinized in a rigorous manner. Yes, it's true, in philosophy class, you're going to find that religious beliefs are critically examined, but so were the principles of things like universal causation that underlies the entire field of the method of scientific inquiry. There was a lot of listening, too. A lot of listening and diverse perspectives that were given ample space to stretch out to their fullest development. And the aim wasn't cheap victory. It wasn't pot shots and drive-by zingers and mic drop moments. The aim was actually understanding. It was exploration. And it was a disciplined, responsible pursuit of knowledge and truth. So it's no lie or exaggeration to say that it was then that I began to really fall in love with wisdom, as the philosophers would have us think of it. And this led to a very extended relationship with higher education, got the BA in Humanities, did the Master of Liberal Studies, eventually got a doctorate at FAU. And when I began my teaching career at Indian River State College in the summer of 2010, just before finishing my doctorate, I began to experience a whole new appreciation for the humanities. I've been sharing my love of ideas and the belief in the power of the humanities to facilitate self-actualization as a professor in the classroom ever since. I've taught a variety of classes: philosophy, ethics, humanity. I get to teach all of the deliciously controversial stuff, but also the stuff that's about personal growth, about the fundamental values of being human. And along the way, I've been a full-time father, which is a very, a difficult task, to say the least, civically engaged citizen, public speaker, and all this business. But in my public speaking, what I've attempted to do, as I've tried to do in the classroom, is bridge this gap between the ivory tower and our ordinary lives. There's too much space between them. Scholars, as I think I've mentioned here before, aren't always the best at communicating ideas to a general public. And I think that's a shame. Too many great ideas are obscured by the high walls of jargon and academic detachment from the elemental goal of life. I think it's spaces like these, Unitarian Universalist congregations, that try to bring these ideas outside of academia into our everyday life experiences that are so important. Because living well and activating our fullest humanity is something that is of importance, of course, to everyone. But let's not pretend that there are spaces for us to do this in our ordinary lives. That's one of the things that makes the college education experience so rich and important, is that we're so busy just trying to survive. We're so busy with our to-do list that it's hard to really find concentrated time and space to explore those questions. And that's why I find students who are required to take humanities courses, when they discover that those courses are actually about them, that those courses are about something more than just a GPA, more than meeting a requirement for a degree, they too begin to find a love of the humanities as well. In August of 2021, I began an online newsletter called Humanities in Revolt, and the aim was to share some of the ideas with a larger public that I typically get stuck teaching strictly in a classroom. And I think the humanities are too important to be confined to colleges and universities, which is, of course, why I'm always grateful to be able to share these thoughts with you all, as I've done over the years. And while it can be said, I think, on the one hand, that the humanities, they're everywhere. They're all around us. We've got music, we've got movies, we've got art and books, Quotes from great thinkers are all over the internet. We have religion, plenty of churches, right? Can't go far without bumping into one. What makes the humanities different as we practice them in higher education is the emphasis on rigorous, sustained evaluation, on critical dialogue, on patient contemplation. We're not just listening to ideas that we like or we have a taste for. We learn to hear ideas that make us uncomfortable, which was so brilliantly on display earlier. It's fairly obvious that I think these are not parts of our ordinary life. I mean, you can go on the internet and find lots of quotes that are, thrown around. But notice how people use quotes as exclamation marks. They find some great quote that's attributed to Einstein. Usually Einstein didn't say it. Einstein did apparently say some things, just not a lot of the things that are attributed to him online. But notice how people use them like exclamation marks, like they're the end of a conversation. When you're in a humanities class, and I've got 30 slides I'm going to go over. We spend half the class on a single slide. We get 3 sentences into a paragraph, and we spend the whole time talking about it. What does that mean to you? What do you think the intent of the author is? How does that apply to your life? Do you think that the author is on the right track? Is it as applicable to us in the 21st century as it was 100 years ago? Or is it now really quite antiquated or erroneous? I mean, that's a very different way to approach a great thinker, a great quote, than what we find. And so, as I say, I think these features of humanistic scholarship, critical cultural engagement and dialogue, they are, of course, also part of Unitarian Universalism. We find actually this, I think, a tenet of the humanities enshrined quite nicely in the 4th principle, which says that we are to pursue a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And the humanities are all about engaging with great thinkers and works of art, philosophy, literature, religion, and taking time to dig into human history to gain vital perspective of what it means to be human. And we're not talking here about biology. We're talking here about normative notions, about values. We're talking beyond strictly facts. Facts are important. We need to get clear on what the facts are. But even once we've gotten the facts straight, we need to figure out what to do with them. We need to figure out what they mean for us. We need to figure out which are more important to us. And this, the humanities, offers us some value. Common sense is one of the main reasons so many, I think, misunderstand why so many students come into a classroom like mine, not quite understanding the humanities. Common sense is one of the reasons why they're underappreciated. Over the last decade, comedians and sitcoms and politicians have criticized the humanities and the broader liberal arts as impractical areas of study, as distractions from the more practical, important matters of, making money and developing scientific, technological knowledge. There's a great example of this from the Thanksgiving episode of a series some of you might be familiar with called That 70s Show. And in one of the hilarious scenes, there's the patriarch, Red Foreman. He asks his daughter, Lori, for an update on how college is going. She's come home for Thanksgiving. And, he's a bit of a conservative working class guy. How's college going? She says, oh, it's going great. I've decided to major in philosophy, she says. So I could just end there and you could fill in the rest of the joke. But at that point, as unfortunately these sibling rivalries do, the brother seizes an opportunity, right, to razz the sister. How could he let this pass? He knows his audience, his father. And, he says, oh, that's good because they just opened a big philosophy factory in Green Bay. And you've got memes that essentially, make the same joke. And these kinds of criticisms, here's the thing that is very interesting to me as a professor of this business, who's been on both sides, who's been that begrudging student, the high school dropout, the begrudging, humanities student. These kinds of criticisms actually prove the vital necessity of the humanities and the liberal arts for democratic society and also for individual flourishing. Philosophy and its pioneers of critical thinking, people like Socrates, have long taught us to be wary of what is commonsensical and to seek out clear, cogent justifications for even the most prominent and seemingly obvious of claims and beliefs. Because common sense, after all, is just a name for beliefs that are endorsed by popular opinion, by dominant cultural tradition, and the beliefs often of those in positions of power who want those ideas to be perpetuated. The humanities emphasizes the thinking skills and the cultural knowledge that enable us to actually culturally assess those beliefs and those practices. The humanities is this family of interrelated areas of cultural inquiry, expression, and creativity, and they encompass everything from philosophy and religion and language arts and visual arts, performing arts, and history. And I think it's encapsulated very nicely the mission of the humanities by that pioneering social psychologist and philosopher that I've quoted so often, Erich Fromm, who put it this way in his book, The Sane Society: the whole life of the individual is nothing but the process of giving birth to himself. Indeed, we should be fully born when we die, although it is the tragic fate of most individuals to die before they are born. Now, that's a challenging quote. If we were in a humanities classroom, we'd have to talk about it for a good hour. And we could talk about it downstairs if you like. But the challenge that Fromm is giving us is to say it's not enough merely to have been birthed by our mothers and given this opportunity to be alive and develop into some sort of mature stage. But it is also a task that must be embraced, that we have to develop ourselves and grow into who we wish to be. And for this, Fromm gives us another wonderful quote that I want to share as I begin to close. A crucial component of this endeavor of developing our fullest potential is the recognition that living a life of excellence requires extraordinary effort and skill. It is not simply a sort of natural process that we can passively sort of lift our arms and give way to. We all know that requires a great deal of skill to fly an airplane, to conduct a surgery. We wouldn't go under the knife with just anybody. What is less understood is that living a good life as a human being also requires skill. Fromm, I think, eloquently summed it up, what it means to understand life as an art, to understand life as a skill, when he said in his book, Man for Himself, not only medicine, engineering, and painting are arts. Living itself is an art. In fact, the most important and at the same time the most difficult and complex art to be practiced by man. Its object is not this or that specialized performance, but the performance of living, the process of developing into that which one is potentially. And the art of living, man is both the artist and the object of his art. He is the sculptor and the marble, the physician and the patient, end quote. We cannot allow ourselves to be sculpted by what? Fate and tradition and those who've come before us and all of their great effort and their good intent, but also their imperfections. Human beings are, of course, filled with so much magnificent potential, but this potential is not realized through passivity or resignation. Fulfillment, Fromm reminds us, does not simply come to us, nor can it just be given to us. It is rather an achievement resulting from knowledge and also from effort.